Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome in, if you're new. Tonight, we're floating back, way back, into the land of marble statues, heroic myths, and, well, some really questionable lifestyle choices. Ancient Greece, the civilization everyone pretends to know a lot about because of movies. But in reality, most of us just remember half a story about Zeus being a serial cheater and Socrates telling people to drink some funny juice. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and let's wander together into a time that looked glamorous in textbooks, but honestly, was full of messy, awkward, and sometimes very harsh realities. Because behind all those temples and togas were people who were surprisingly human, jealous, petty, anxious, and in some cases, just plain weird. And don't worry, we'll take it slow. Let's start with something simple. The Greeks loved to brag about their polis. These little city-states, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, basically a neighborhood that decided it was too special to just be called a town. Each had its own rules, armies, and ways of life. It's like if your street suddenly decided it was its own independent nation, with its own version of Starbucks and its own national anthem. Now Athens loved democracy. That's what they're famous for. But here's the awkward truth. If you weren't a man, and you weren't a landowning citizen, you didn't get a vote. Women? Nope. Slaves? Definitely not. Foreigners? Forget it. So, when people say the birthplace of democracy, just remember, it was basically 10% of the population calling the shots, while everyone else kept the economy running. Classic. Meanwhile, over in Sparta, things were very different. Their whole society was built around the military. Boys were taken from their families at age 7, tossed into barracks, and basically told, "Good luck, try not to cry." It was called the Agoge, a kind of hardcore boot camp that lasted into their 20s. And if you're thinking, wow, that must have made them emotionally tough, yes and no. Mostly, it just made them people who never hugged their mom again. Spartans believed weakness should be eliminated early. Infants were inspected, and if they didn't look strong enough, well, let's just say they weren't signing up that baby for daycare. This was their version of quality control. Which, yeah, sounds brutal. But hey, at least you didn't have to stress about paying for school lunches. Now, Athens liked to present themselves as the cultured ones. They had plays, philosophers, and men in sandals debating about the meaning of life while probably smelling like olives. But don't be fooled. They also had slaves doing most of the actual labor, and their politicians. Well, let's just say corruption isn't a modern invention. Votes could be swayed, alliances bought, and every so often, someone would just get ostracized, which, by the way, wasn't some vague social cancellation. It literally meant being exiled for 10 years. People would write your name on a shard of pottery. And if you got enough votes, congratulations, you were banished. Ancient democracy had a block button. And of course, there were the philosophers. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the greats. But let's be honest, half of their deep thoughts sound like shower thoughts. Like, what is truth? Or does the chair exist? Or is it only the idea of a chair? Imagine being Plato's student. You just want a normal day, but suddenly you're stuck in a lecture about whether your lunch is real or not. Exhausting. Speaking of exhausting, let's talk about Greek diets. People often imagine banquets with roasted meats and endless wine. The reality was bread, olives, figs, maybe some cheese if you were lucky, and watered down wine, always watered down. Because apparently, drinking it straight was seen as barbaric. And yet, these were the same people who thought mixing wine with seawater was a good idea. And their hygiene. Yeah, mixed reviews. Bathing wasn't as glamorous as Roman bathhouses later on. Soap wasn't really a thing. Instead, you rubbed yourself down with olive oil and then scraped it off with a little metal tool called a stricchio, which sounds kind of relaxing until you realize you're basically exfoliating with salad dressing. Now, one of the harshest realities of ancient Greece was medicine, or rather, the lack of it. Doctors didn't exactly have a solid grip on anatomy. The great physician Hippocrates is remembered as the father of medicine, but his main theory was that your body was controlled by IV fluids, or humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, they thought it was because one of those was out of balance. So the solution was often bleeding you, because apparently the cure for feeling weak was making you even weaker. Surgery, not great. Anesthesia didn't exist. Your best painkiller was maybe some wine and a prayer to Apollo. Honestly, if you survived a medical procedure back then, you deserved a trophy. Let's float over to daily life for women in Athens. Spoiler, it wasn't exactly glamorous. Women were expected to stay home, manage the household, and keep quiet. Their main role, producing legitimate heirs. Athenian men loved to debate about justice and equality, but not when it came to their wives. In fact, many men spent more time with courtesans and companions than with their actual families. So, yes, the golden age of Athens wasn't all that golden if you were a woman. Sparta was a bit different. Spartan women had more freedom. They could own land. They exercised. They even spoke up in public. But that wasn't because of feminism. It was because the men were constantly away at war. So someone had to keep things running. Basically, Spartan women had power because men weren't around to stop them. Small victories. And then we have religion. The Greeks worshipped a whole dysfunctional family of gods. Zeus, the king of the gods, was famous for turning into swans, bulls, or random showers of gold. All so he could seduce people. Which honestly makes Tinder look very normal by comparison. Hera, his wife, spent most of her divine career being angry about it. Poseidon, god of the sea, liked causing earthquakes just because he was moody, and poor Hades got stuck ruling the underworld like some goth sibling nobody invited to the party. The gods were basically a mirror of human flaws, just with more lightning bolts. If you prayed, sacrificed, and built temples, maybe they'd help you out, or maybe they'd ruin your life for fun. Totally dependable. Let's also not forget war. The Greeks were constantly fighting each other. Athens versus Sparta. Sparta versus Thebes. Corinth just kind of hanging around waiting for a fight. The Peloponnesian War lasted nearly 30 years and left everyone exhausted. Athens tried to flex as a naval power, but eventually lost. Sparta briefly got bragging rights. But then Thebes came in and slapped them around. And then, of course, Macedon showed up, because there's always a bigger fish. Which brings us to one of the most famous Greek figures, Alexander the Great. Now, we'll get to him properly in a later part, but here's a preview. He was 20 when he became king. He conquered most of the known world before age 33. And he had the emotional stability of a caffeinated teenager. His troops adored him, but also feared him. He drank too much, cried a lot, and named dozens of cities after himself, because of course he did. But before we drift too far forward, let's ground ourselves again in everyday harshness. Child mortality was high. Life expectancy wasn't great. Even if you survived childhood, you might get taken by war, disease, or an unfortunate philosophical duel. For ordinary people, survival meant farming hard, eating simply, and hoping the gods didn't notice you. The beauty of marble statues and shining temples hides a truth. Life in ancient Greece was often short, uncomfortable, and unpredictable. And yet, this messy little civilization gave us theater, philosophy, democracy, and math we still use today. Strange, isn't it? A society that lived with so much daily struggle still found time to ask if numbers were real. And that feels like a good place to pause for now. We've settled into the world of ancient Greece. Not the polished, glamorous version, but the rough, sweaty, and slightly dysfunctional one. Next time, we'll drift into even more peculiar corners, from eccentric philosophers to tragic kings, and all the little oddities that made this world both brilliant and bizarre. So just stay comfortable. We'll keep wandering. Alright, so we've painted the backdrop. Ancient Greece wasn't marble perfection. It was messy and exhausting. Now, let's sink deeper into the people who actually lived in it. Because if there's one thing the Greeks produced more than olives, it was complicated personalities. Let's start with the philosophers. Everyone's favorite dinner party name we already mentioned, Socrates. He's the old man who wandered around Athens, asking people annoying questions until they either hated him or started questioning their entire existence. His method was simple. Take any confident statement and keep poking holes in it until the other person broke down. It's basically the ancient version of an internet troll, except he did it face to face, in a robe, barefoot. Socrates didn't write anything down, which is convenient because it meant all his ideas came secondhand through Plato. And Plato, well, he adored Socrates. So of course, Socrates gets remembered as this wise guru rather than the cranky old guy who probably smelled like the Athenian marketplace. His death, also very Greek. The Athenians accused him of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, so they gave him a choice, exile or death. Naturally, Socrates picked death, because why not turn your exit into a statement? He calmly drank hemlock poison in front of his friends. Very dramatic, very philosophical, and slightly impractical. Then we have Plato. If Socrates was the troll, Plato was the guy building an entire theme park around the trolling. He loved to construct dialogues, mostly with Socrates as the star. His biggest idea, the theory of forms. Basically, that everything we see in the world is just a shadow of a perfect, invisible version that exists somewhere else. So, every bed, every tree, every goat, just a copy of the ideal cosmic bed, tree, or goat. Honestly, it sounds deep, but also, it sounds like the ramblings of someone who's had one too many cups of watered wine. And then comes Aristotle, Plato's student. Unlike Plato, Aristotle wasn't obsessed with perfect forms, floating in space. He preferred practical observation. He studied animals, weather, politics, theater, ethics, basically everything. He is the kid in class who not only does his own homework, but also corrects the teacher, and somehow still gets invited to lunch. But here's the twist. Aristotle ended up tutoring Alexander the Great, which meant the man who wrote essays about moderation had to teach a teenage warlord who thought moderation was boring. Not exactly a success story. Now, let's drift away from the philosophers and into politics, which, surprise, surprise, was just as messy as anywhere else. Take Pericles, Athens' golden boy, tall, eloquent, with a helmet that basically became part of his head in every statue. He led Athens during its cultural peak. Under him, they built the Parthenon, funded the arts, and strutted around like the cool kids of Greece. But he also dragged Athens into the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, which did not end well. And then there's Alcibiades. If Pericles was the responsible older sibling, Alcibiades was the chaotic nephew nobody could control. He was good-looking, wealthy, and charming, which basically meant people forgave him for being a political nightmare. He switched sides in the Peloponnesian War multiple times. Athens, Sparta, Persia, whoever offered the best deal. It's like he was playing Risk, but with real soldiers. And yes, he had scandals. Allegedly mutilating statues of Hermes. Allegedly seducing other men's wives. Allegedly being too fabulous for his own good. Truly, the drama never stopped. And then we've got the kings. Let's not forget them. While Athens played a democracy, other parts of Greece clung to monarchies. Some kings were respected, others, not so much. Take King Cleomenes of Sparta. He was known for drinking a lot of undiluted wine, which, remember, was a scandal in Greece. He eventually went mad, according to the sources, and reportedly committed suicide in a very gruesome way. Which, let's be real, might have been propaganda. But either way, his reign didn't exactly scream stability. Or King Pausanias, another Spartan commander who got accused of plotting with the Persians. He ended up taking refuge in a temple to avoid punishment. So the Spartans, in their usual logical fashion, just sealed the temple door and starved him to death. Problem solved. Speaking of Persia, let's take a slow detour into the famous wars. Because if there's one thing the Greeks loved more than fighting each other, it was fighting outsiders. The Persian Wars. Legendary stuff. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis. You've heard the names. But here's the reality check. They weren't glorious superhero moments. They were desperate, bloody, and full of mistakes. Marathon. Yes, the Athenians won against the Persians. But the whole guy runs 26 miles and then dies. Story. That's mostly legend. Still, it gave us the modern marathon. So, thanks, I guess. Thermopylae. 300 Spartans against the world. Except, there were also thousands of other Greek allies there. But they don't get a movie, because it's less marketable. King Leonidas and his men fought bravely, sure, but in the end, they were wiped out. Not exactly a win. Salamis. The Greeks managed to lure the Persian fleet into a narrow strait and outmaneuver them. A clever naval trick. But again, layabs, cinematic than slow motion, Spartan abs. The truth is, the Persians weren't some faceless evil empire. They were an advanced, wealthy civilization. But the Greeks needed an enemy to define themselves against. So Persia became the perfect foil. Now, let's bring it back to the everyday person again. Because while kings and generals played their games, ordinary Greeks were busy trying to stay alive. Farming was hard. The land was rocky, dry, and not exactly generous. Grapes and olives thrived, sure, but wheat, barley, not always reliable, which meant famines were a recurring problem. Entertainment, theater was a big deal. But even there, the themes were heavy. Tragedies about fate, curses, and family members accidentally killing or marrying each other. Comedies about politicians being corrupt and citizens being ridiculous. Basically, the ancient Netflix lineup was either deeply depressing or aggressively satirical. And let's not forget slavery, a huge part of Greek society. Slaves did household work, farming, mining, even educated roles like tutoring. Freedom for them was rare. And while Greeks prided themselves on liberty, that liberty only applied to a very specific group of men. Everyone else carried the weight. Religion again. We can't avoid it. Festivals, sacrifices, temples. The Greeks treated their gods like temperamental landlords. You offered prayers and sacrifices in hopes they wouldn't ruin your harvest or your marriage. And sometimes, you just hoped they were distracted bothering someone else. The Oracle of Delphi was the hotline to the divine. People traveled from all over to ask questions. The priestess, usually in a trance from fumes rising out of the earth, would mutter cryptic phrases. Politicians loved to use her answers to justify whatever they already wanted to do. The oracle says, invade Persia. Oh well, if the gods say so. Convenient. And then, slowly, as we drift toward the later years, Greece's independence began to crumble. City-states weakened each other through endless wars. And then came Macedon, a kingdom to the north that Greeks used to look down on as rustic and uncivilized. But guess what? They got organized. Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, built a powerful army and systematically took over Greece. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, all eventually had to bow. It turns out the uncivilized Macedonians were better at playing the game. And from there, well, history shifts. Alexander steps onto the stage. But maybe we'll save him for a little later. He deserves his own long, winding spotlight. So let's pause here again. We've drifted through philosophers asking annoying questions, kings making poor life choices, wars that were less glorious than advertised, and the grinding reality of daily Greek survival. Not exactly the postcard version of ancient Greece, but maybe more honest, and certainly more human. Take a slow breath. We're not done wandering yet. So, we finally arrive at Alexander. The name alone sounds big, the Great, which is funny, because nobody called him that while he was alive. That was branding added later. At the time, most people probably just called him that overly intense Macedonian kid. Alexander was born in 356 BCE, in the city of Pella, the capital of Macedonia. His dad was King Philip II, a guy who basically strong-armed Greece into submission. His mom was Olympias, a woman known for being fiercely ambitious, intensely religious, and not particularly interested in playing nice with anyone. Perfect recipe for raising a future conqueror. Now, Philip was complicated, brilliant, general, ruthless politician, serial womanizer. He married multiple wives for alliances, which of course made family dinners a nightmare. Olympias was just one of them, and she didn't like sharing the spotlight. She supposedly told young Alexander that he was descended from Achilles, and that Zeus, not Philip, was his real father. Imagine being a teenager and your mom is constantly whispering, "Don't worry, sweetie, you're basically a demigod, no pressure." Alexander's childhood was full of strange lessons. He was tutored by Aristotle himself, which sounds impressive, but imagine being a restless boy, forced to sit through lectures about ethics, biology, and the meaning of tragedy, when all you want to do is swing a sword around. Aristotle tried to instill philosophy, moderation, balance. Alexander nodded politely, then spent his adult life doing the opposite. He also had the classic prove-yourself moment with a horse. The famous Bucephalus, a giant, wild stallion that nobody could tame. Alexander, maybe 12 years old, noticed the horse was afraid of its own shadow. So he calmly turned the animal toward the sun and mounted it. And boom, lifelong bond. It's a cute story. Though, realistically, it probably just meant Alexander had way too much confidence for a preteen. Now, Philip expected Alexander to succeed him one day, but he didn't always make that clear. He had other children, other wives, and plenty of rivals, which meant Alexander grew up in a tense palace environment, never sure if he was being groomed as heir or quietly sidelined. Olympias, of course, fanned the flames. She constantly reminded Alexander that he was destined for greatness and that everyone else was a threat. Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE. The details are still debated. A disgruntled bodyguard stabbed him during a wedding celebration. Was it personal revenge? A conspiracy? Maybe Olympias had a hand in it. Historians love to speculate. Either way, 20-year-old Alexander suddenly found himself king, and he wasted no time. He crushed rivals, eliminated possible threats, and made sure everyone understood. He wasn't just Philip's replacement. He was a force of nature. So, Alexander sets out. His mission, conquer Persia. Because if there's one thing that unites Greece, it's hating Persians. And also, why not aim for the biggest empire around? In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with about 40,000 men, which sounds like a lot until you realize the Persian Empire had millions of subjects. But Alexander wasn't about numbers. He was about audacity. The first big showdown was the Battle of Granicus. Persian satraps, basically governors, lined up to stop him. Alexander, as usual, led from the front, which is heroic, but also reckless. He nearly died in that battle. A Persian noble struck him with an axe, but his general Cletus, nicknamed the Black, saved his life. This wouldn't be the last time Cletus played hero. From there, Alexander marched on. He won another stunning victory at Issus in 333 BCE, where he faced King Darius III himself. The Persians had numbers, but the terrain worked in Alexander's favor. Darius fled the battlefield, leaving behind his family. Awkward, Alexander treated them with surprising respect. But he also loved reminding people that even kings could run away. Now, Alexander wasn't just a fighter. He was a builder of legends. Every victory was accompanied by theatrics. He spread stories about himself, claimed divine favor, and, of course, founded cities. Dozens of them, most named Alexandria. Imagine being his soldiers, trudging along, only to hear great news. Men were founding another Alexandria. By the 10th one, they'd probably roll their eyes. But Alexander was obsessed with legacy. He wanted his name stamped everywhere. Literally, the big climax came at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. This was the showdown. Darius assembled a massive army with chariots and war elephants. Alexander did what Alexander always did. He led a precise cavalry charge right at the weak spot, broke the Persian line, and once again Darius fled. Persia was effectively his. Now here's where things get strange. Alexander could have gone home, a hero. He'd avenged Greece, destroyed Persian power, and made himself ruler of an empire. But that wasn't enough. He wanted more, always more. As Alexander marched deeper into Asia, he started adopting Persian customs, wearing royal robes, demanding people bow before him in proskynesis. His Macedonian companions were horrified. They still thought of themselves as rough warriors, not pampered kings. But Alexander was changing. He saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as a world emperor, a divine figure. This caused cracks in his friendships. Remember Cletus, the man who saved his life. In a drunken quarrel, Alexander killed him, stabbed him in a rage. The next morning, he wept and tried to bring Cletus back to life. But too late. It was one of many emotional meltdowns that followed him everywhere. And then came India. Alexander marched his exhausted army across mountains, rivers, and monsoons. At the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE, he faced King Porus, who brought war elephants into battle. Alexander won, but the fight was brutal. His army admired him, but they were tired. After years of conquest, they mutinied. At the Hyphasis River, they refused to march any further east. Alexander sulked, raged, begged, but in the end, even he couldn't force them. The world conqueror was stopped, not by an enemy, but by his own men's exhaustion. The return journey was hell. Alexander led his army through the Jedrosian Desert, modern Iran, and Pakistan, where thousands died of thirst. It was a pointless march, more about proving his willpower than strategy. But again, Alexander was never practical. He was obsessed with glory. By the time he reached Babylon in 323 BCE, he was only 32, and then he died. Fever, poisoning, malaria, typhoid. Historians argue endlessly. What's certain is that the man who tried to rule the world left it suddenly, without an heir. His generals carved up the empire. His cities survived, but his dream of a united world collapsed. And yet, the legend stuck. Alexander the Great, the boy who believed he was a demigod, and lived like it until his body gave out. It's a strangely fitting story. Brilliant, reckless, tragic. A man raised by ambition, consumed by ambition, and ultimately destroyed by it. And maybe that's why he still fascinates us. Not because he conquered so much, but because he never knew how to stop. Take a slow breath. We'll drift on, past Alexander's ghost, into the world that followed, his successors, the messy kingdoms, the slow unraveling of Greek independence, and all the personal disasters that came with it. So, Alexander is gone. 32 years old, conquered half the known world, built a legend, and then left without a plan. No clear heir, no neat instructions. Just a massive, unstable empire stretching from Greece to India. Classic Alexander move. When his generals asked who should rule after him, he supposedly muttered, "To the strongest," which, if he actually said that, was the most chaotic thing possible. Because of course, everyone thought they were the strongest. And so began the Wars of the Diadochi, a 40-year soap opera featuring betrayals, shifting alliances, awkward family marriages, and a lot of people named Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus. Strap in. First up, the immediate problem. Alexander did technically leave heirs, sort of. His wife Roxana was pregnant. Later she gave birth to a boy, Alexander IV. There was also another potential heir, Philip Aridius, Alexander's half-brother. But Philip had developmental issues, probably from inbreeding. So the generals decided, fine, let's make them joint kings. A toddler and a disabled man ruling the largest empire in the world. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Of course, they didn't actually rule. The generals did. They called themselves regents at first. You know, temporary babysitters for the empire. But babysitters who quietly kept the car keys and the bank accounts. The most powerful of these babysitters was Perdiccas. He tried to hold everything together in Alexander's name, which, naturally, made everyone else hate him. Within a couple of years, he was assassinated by his own men after a failed campaign in Egypt. So much for unity. And speaking of Egypt and Ptolemy, probably the smartest of Alexander's companions. When Alexander's body was being transported back to Macedon, Ptolemy hijacked a funeral procession and brought it to Egypt. Because nothing screams legitimacy like keeping the dead conqueror's corpse in your territory. He buried Alexander in Alexandria, turned Egypt into his personal kingdom, and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. Yes, the same line that would eventually give us Cleopatra. Smart move. Creepy move. But smart. Meanwhile, in the east, Seleucus carved out a vast empire covering Persia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. The Seleucid Empire. Big, sprawling, hard to manage. Basically, the too much house, not enough furniture problem. Then there was Antigonus. Loud, ambitious, one-eyed. He wanted the whole empire. For a while, he came close. He controlled much of Asia Minor and even threatened Greece. His nickname, Monophthalmus, which yes, literally means the one-eyed. Ancient nicknames were not subtle, and Lysimachus less famous, but he grabbed Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. He mostly ruled by being grumpy and stabbing people who disagreed with him. Effective, if not elegant. Now, remember little Alexander IV and Philip Aridius. Yeah, they didn't last long. After years of being political pawns, both were eventually murdered. Olympias Alexander's mom tried to defend her grandson's rights for a while, but she too was killed when she became too much of a problem. By the time the dust settled, the so-called Argead dynasty of Alexander's family was extinct. His bloodline was gone. What remained was a Diadochi, carving up the empire like a birthday cake, each slice turning into its own kingdom. Let's zoom in on some of the soap opera moments. Antigonus the One-Eyed and his son Demetrius the Besieger were the drama kings of the era. Demetrius got his nickname for inventing massive siege engines, some the size of apartment buildings. Impressive, yes. Practical, not always. He was also famous for his love of luxury. Silk robes, feasts, mistresses. The kind of guy who spent a fortune on parties while his soldiers begged for pay. Demetrius even briefly ruled Macedonia, but eventually lost everything and died in captivity. His descendants, though, kept popping up for generations. Because Greek dynasties were basically like weeds once. They rooted. They never quite went away. And then there was Seleucus. He might have been the most enduring of Alexander's successors. His empire stretched from Turkey to India. But again, holding that much land together was impossible. Revolts, invasions, cultural clashes. He did his best, but it was like herding cats. Very large, heavily armed cats. Ptolemy, on the other hand, had the advantage. Egypt was stable, wealthy, and naturally defended by deserts. The Ptolemies lasted almost 3 centuries. Their trick, marrying each other, literally. Brother and sister marriages became standard. It kept power in the family. also created some spectacularly dysfunctional rulers, but we'll float into them later. The wars between the Diadochi were constant, temporary alliances, sudden betrayals, battles where yesterday's friend became today's enemy. If you've ever tried to keep track of a long-running TV series where characters switch sides constantly, that's basically the Diadochi. The big showdown came at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. Antigonus, the one-eyed, finally overreached. The other generals ganged up on him. He was killed in battle, and his empire collapsed. From then on, no one even pretended unity was possible. The empire of Alexander was officially gone, replaced by three main dynasties: the Seleucids in the east, the Antigonids in Macedon, and the Ptolemies in Egypt. And what about Alexander's dream of unity? Blended cultures, Greeks and Persians, ruling side by side. It faded. The successors used local traditions when convenient, but mostly, they fought for power. Alexander had imagined himself as a godlike ruler of all humanity. His generals just wanted more land. But they did keep one thing alive: the Greek cultural stamp. Cities, theaters, philosophy, gymnasiums. Greek became the language of the elite across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, even as they butchered each other. The Diadochi spread Hellenistic culture far and wide. So, in a strange way, Alexander's messy legacy lived on, not in unity, but in influence. The irony is hard to miss. The man who couldn't stop conquering left behind a world where everyone else couldn't stop fighting over his leftovers. For decades, they bickered, killed, and betrayed, all while insisting they were the rightful heirs to his greatness. And maybe that's the harshest reality of all. Alexander wanted eternal glory. What he left was chaos. Take another slow breath. We'll let the Diadochi fade into the background for now. Next, we drift into one of the most infamous results of all this: the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. A family so inbred, so dramatic, so deeply dysfunctional. They make Alexander's story look tame. So, remember how Alexander's general Ptolemy snagged Egypt and tucked Alexander's corpse safely in Alexandria? That little stunt set the stage for almost 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. On paper, it looked great. Egypt was rich, fertile, and naturally protected. The Nile kept the crops flowing. The desert kept most invaders away. All Ptolemy had to do was sit back, collect taxes, and make sure the granaries stayed full. Simple, right? Not exactly. Because this dynasty had one favorite hobby: marrying each other. Brothers, sisters, cousins. If you've ever looked at a family tree and thought, wow, that branch looks a little tangled, the Ptolemies basically turned the whole tree into a knot. Let's start with Ptolemy. He was the founder. Clever, cautious, and actually kind of normal by Ptolemaic standards. He declared himself pharaoh, but didn't go overboard. Married into the local elite, built libraries, funded scholars. He established the Library of Alexandria, which aimed to collect every text in the known world. Ambitious, nerdy, respectable. But once he died, the family started unraveling. His successors all shared the same name, Ptolemy, to keep track. Historians number them: Ptolemy II, 3, 4, all the way down to 15. Which means if you're reading ancient sources, it feels like the same guy keeps living for 300 years. Very confusing. And it wasn't just the men. The women of the dynasty loved recycling names too. Lots of Cleopatras, Berenices, and Arsanues. Family reunions must have been a nightmare. Ptolemy, to Philadelphus, is where things got juicy. His nickname means sibling loving, and yes, that's because he married his sister, Arsinoe, to the Greeks. This was scandalous. To the Egyptians, it was fine. Pharaohs often married siblings to keep the bloodline pure. The Ptolemies leaned hard into that tradition. They marketed themselves as divine rulers, just like the old pharaohs. Brother and sister power couples. Romantic if you ignore the DNA issues. From then on, it became the dynasty's signature move. Ptolemies marrying Ptolemies, producing children who were technically their own cousins twice over. And as you might guess, this didn't exactly produce stable personalities. Ptolemy IV is a good example. Lazy, indulgent, and more interested in drinking parties than governing. Ancient sources claim he built a giant royal barge, so luxurious it was practically a floating palace. He let his corrupt ministers run the country while he lounged around. When he died, his wife's sister Arsinoe III was conveniently murdered so his cronies could hold power. Because in Ptolemaic Egypt, you didn't just inherit a throne, you inherited a target on your back. Then comes Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon, which roughly translates to fatty. Not the most flattering royal title. He was notorious for cruelty and pettiness. At one point, he married his sister, then later married his niece. At another point, he expelled scholars from Alexandria because they made fun of him. Which, honestly, fair. But also, maybe don't run a dynasty like a high school grudge. Physcon supposedly killed his own son and chopped him into pieces to send to his wife as a present. Romantic. That's the Ptolemies for you. And of course, we eventually reach the most famous member, Cleopatra VII. Yes, the Cleopatra, the last ruler of the dynasty, and the one who still gets Hollywood movies. But before we get to her, let's remember, she was the product of generations of sibling marriages. Her family background was not exactly stable. By the time she came to power, the dynasty had been weakened by internal feuds, assassinations, and Roman meddling. Cleopatra, though, was clever, multilingual, politically savvy. Unlike many of her relatives, she could actually handle a conversation without stabbing someone at the end of it. She understood Egypt, spoke Egyptian fluently, something most of her predecessors never bothered to do, and knew Rome was the rising power she had to deal with. Her story, with Julius Caesar, with Mark Antony, with Octavian, is dramatic. But we'll keep it calm. For now, just note, Cleopatra wasn't some exotic temptress like later propaganda painted her. She was a survivor in a collapsing dynasty. The real pattern here, the Ptolemies loved spectacle, but hated stability. They built dazzling monuments, sponsored scholars, and posed as gods on earth. But behind the scenes, they were constantly poisoning, backstabbing, and scheming against each other. It's almost funny, in a sleepy kind of way. They controlled one of the richest lands in the world. And yet they couldn't stop acting like jealous teenagers, fighting over who gets the bigger bedroom. And through it all, Egypt endured. The farmers kept planting, the Nile kept flooding, the taxes kept rolling in. Ordinary people probably didn't care which Ptolemy or Cleopatra was technically in charge. They just wanted bread. In the end, Rome swallowed them whole. After Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt became a Roman province. The Ptolemies vanished. Well, not vanished exactly. Their messy family line lived on in Roman gossip for a while, but their dynasty was over. Still, they left a strange legacy, a dynasty that tried to mix Greek and Egyptian traditions, a family that thought sibling marriage was normal, a group of rulers so dysfunctional that their reputation has lasted 2,000 years. So, if you ever feel bad about your family squabbles, just remember the Ptolemies. At least your brother isn't plotting to feed you poisoned figs. Take another slow breath. We'll let the Nile fade into the background. Next, we'll drift into the Seleucids, another one of Alexander's successor dynasties, less famous than the Ptolemies, but just as full of odd characters, overreaching kings, and the occasional tragic meltdown. When Alexander the Great died, one of his generals, Seleucus I Niceta, grabbed a huge slice of territory. And by huge, I mean absurd. His empire stretched from modern-day Turkey all the way into Iran, parts of Afghanistan, and even nudged at India. Imagine inheriting a continent-sized apartment and then realizing you, Dan, THF, enough furniture, enough patience to fill it. Seleucus actually managed okay. He founded cities everywhere, often named Seleucia, because apparently originality wasn't a priority. He established Seleucia on the Tigris as his capital, which was meant to rival Babylon. And for a while, things looked impressive. But here's the problem. When your empire is basically 10 countries stapled together, things fall apart fast. Let's start with Antiochus I, Seleucus' son. His mother was Persian, so he embodied that Greek-Persian blend the Seleucids claimed to represent. But the reality was messy. Greeks in the empire wanted one thing, Persians wanted another. Local rulers wanted autonomy. Antiochus tried to balance it all while fighting constant rebellions. He spent so much energy just trying to keep the empire glued together that he earned the nickname Soter, the savior, which is ironic because the empire needed saving from itself. Then came Antiochus II, known as Theos, or the god. Why? Because he freed a city from tyranny and they declared him divine. Nice PR. Less nice was his family life. He married Laodice, then dumped her to marry Bernice, daughter of the Egyptian king. A classic dynastic marriage. But when he died, Laodice poisoned Bernice and her child, then installed her own son on the throne. Moral of the story: don't mess with a Seleucid queen. Now, here's where things start to spiral. The Seleucids loved fighting the Ptolemies. They fought so many wars over Syria that historians just call them the Syrian Wars, numbered 1 through 6. It's basically a centuries-long custody battle over a strip of land. Each war drained money, soldiers, and patience. And each time, the Seleucids got a little weaker. Enter Antiochus III, also called the Great. Finally, a Seleucid who seemed promising. He rebuilt the empire, reconquered lost territories, even pushed into India for a bit. For a moment, it looked like the Seleucids might actually stabilize. But then, he picked a fight with Rome. Bad move. Antiochus thought he could challenge Roman power in Greece. Spoiler, he couldn't. He got smacked down at the Battle of Magnesia. In 190 BCE, the Romans forced him to pay huge reparations and hand over territory. Antiochus limped home, tried to refill the treasury by looting a temple, and was killed by angry locals. Not exactly a dignified ending for the great. His son, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, is probably the most infamous Seleucid. His nickname means God Manifest, which already tells you about his ego. People who hated him twisted it into Epimanes, meaning the mad. And honestly, he lived up to it. Antiochus liked showy gestures. He threw lavish parades with elephants and golden chariots. He meddled constantly in local religions. He's best known for his policies in Judea, where he banned Jewish practices and tried to force Greek customs, sparking the Maccabean revolt. Not exactly a wise way to win hearts and minds. Ancient sources say he once tried to invade Egypt, but got humiliated when a Roman envoy literally drew a circle around him in the sand and told him to make a decision before stepping out. Antiochus backed down. Not a great look for a supposed God manifest. By this point, the Seleucid Empire was cracking. Civil wars, assassinations, endless coups. Kings came and went so quickly, it's hard to keep track. Some ruled for a few years, some for a few months. At one point, 2 different kings claimed the throne simultaneously, both named Antiochus, which is about as confusing as it sounds. There's even a stretch where little child kings were being put on the throne, only to be used as pawns by ambitious generals or scheming regents. Imagine a toddler technically being king while adults stabbed each other in the background. That was Seleucid politics. The last few Seleucids were basically Roman puppets. Their empire shrank down to Syria. By 63 BCE, Pompey the Great marched in, annexed what was left, and declared Syria a Roman province. Just like that, centuries of Seleucid chaos fizzled out. So what do we take from this? The Seleucids tried to manage too much land, with too little unity, and far too many men named They fought constant wars they couldn't afford. tangled themselves in dynastic drama, and got outplayed by Rome. But they did leave behind a strange cultural blend. Greek cities in the east, Hellenistic art and architecture, coins with kings who looked a little too smug for their own good. Their empire didn't last, but it helped spread Greek influence deep into Asia. Still, if you ever feel overwhelmed managing your inbox, just imagine being a Seleucid king, juggling 10 rebellions, 5 wars, and 3 rival claimants to your throne, all while your family poisons each other. Take another slow breath, let the dust of Syria settle. Next, we'll wander over to another curious dynasty, the Attalids of Pergamon. Smaller, quirkier, but full of their own odd choices and dynastic dramas. So, imagine you're living in the shadow of giants. To the west, you've got Rome rising like an unstoppable machine. To the south, Egypt with its pyramid-obsessed soap opera dynasty. To the east, the Seleucids with their endless supply of Antiochuses and civil wars. And then, tucked neatly in Asia Minor, you've got Pergamon. Not a huge empire, not really a household name, but the Attalid dynasty managed to carve out a respectable kingdom and hang on for almost 2 centuries. Their secret weapon, sucking up to Rome. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. It starts with a guy named Philetaerus. Originally, he wasn't even royalty. He was just a trusted commander who got control of Pergamon's fortress around 280 to BCE. Thanks to a huge treasury left under his watch, he essentially became king without calling himself king. And here's a fun twist. Philetaerus was a eunuch. Yup, the founder of the dynasty had no children of his own. So how did the dynasty continue? Adoption, a very practical solution in a world where dynasties usually obsessed over bloodlines. Philetaerus adopted his nephew, Humanzai, who took over after him. Humans fought off Seleucid attempts to reclaim Pergamon, expanded the territory a bit, and, most importantly, kept that treasure chest full. The real rise came under Attalus I. Finally, we get the dynasty's namesake. Attalus liked to portray himself as a heroic defender of Greek freedom against barbarian threats, mainly the Galatians, those Celtic tribes who had wandered into Asia Minor. He beat them in battle and declared himself king. Because nothing says legitimacy like I killed some scary neighbors. Now bow to me. Attalus was also the first Attalid to really cozy up to Rome. He sent troops to help the Romans fight their wars in Greece. He realized early on that Rome was the horse to bet on. And honestly, that strategy kept Pergamon safe for generations. Now, one thing the Attalids loved almost as much as Rome was Cotubio. Pergamon became famous for its library, second only to Alexandria's. Legend says, when Egypt banned the export of papyrus to weaken Pergamon, the city developed parchment instead, hence the word parchment, from Pergamena. So the Attalids may not have ruled a huge empire, but they did give us better stationery. Not a bad legacy. They also built giant altars, impressive sculptures, and turned Pergamon into a showcase of Hellenistic art. Their great altar of Zeus was basically a giant marble billboard saying, "We're small, but we're stylish." Of course, it wasn't all book collecting and marble carving. There was still dynastic drama. These were still Greek monarchs, after all. Take Humans too, who ruled for decades. He expanded Pergamon's territory after helping Rome defeat the Seleucids. He married his cousin Stratonus, because heaven forbid these families look outside their immediate circle. He had to fend off plots from his own brother, Attalus. Yes, they kept recycling that name too. Then came Attalus II, nicknamed Philadelphus, which, as we learned with the Ptolemies, usually meant brother-loving. In this case, it was more literal in the wholesome sense. He stayed loyal to his brother Humans, served as co-ruler, and only took over when Humans died, which, by dynastic standards, is practically saintly. The dynasty's finale came with Attalus III, who was a little eccentric. He didn't seem interested in ruling much at all. Instead, he spent his time in the palace tinkering with herbal remedies and poisons, which, to be fair, is kind of on brand for Hellenistic monarchs. But it made him look more like a moody alchemist than a king. And when he died in 133 BCE, he did something remarkable. He willed his entire kingdom to Rome. Just handed it over, like leaving your house to your neighbor, because you can't be bothered with upkeep anymore. Historians still debate why. Maybe he didn't have heirs he trusted. Maybe he figured Pergamon was too small to resist Rome anyway. Or maybe he just liked Rome that much. Whatever the reason, Pergamon became the Roman province of Asia, and the Attalids were no more. So, the Attalids stand out for a few reasons. They weren't massive conquerors. They weren't spectacularly dysfunctional, like the Ptolemies. But they were clever enough to survive in a dangerous neighborhood by making Rome their BFF, and they left behind cultural treasures that still impress today. They're kind of the teacher's pet of Hellenistic dynasties. Never the biggest, never the loudest, but always smiling at Rome and saying, "Yes, of course, we'll help with your homework." And with Pergamon quietly folded into Rome's growing empire, we've just about closed the book on the major successor states of Alexander. But don't worry, our journey isn't over. Next, we'll drift away from dynasties and look at the ordinary realities of daily life in ancient Greece. When you imagine ancient Greece, you probably think of marble temples, dramatic philosophers, or maybe a half-naked Spartan yelling in slow motion. But the truth is far more ordinary. Most Greeks weren't philosophers or warriors. They were farmers, potters, shepherds, or people just trying not to get fined for missing jury duty. Let's start with food. Breakfast was simple. Bread dipped in wine. Yes, wine for breakfast. Before you get too excited, it wasn't the heavy stuff. It was diluted, more like grape-flavored water. Lunch might be bread with some cheese, olives, or figs. Dinner was the main event, usually vegetables, more bread, maybe fish if you lived near the coast. Meat was rare unless there was a religious festival. So if you picture Greeks constantly feasting on roasted lamb, no, more likely they were eating barley porridge and wishing it tasted like lamb. And they loved olive oil. They put it on bread, in food, on their skin, even in lamps. Olive oil was basically the duct tape of ancient Greece. Housing was pretty modest. Mud brick walls, small courtyards, simple wooden furniture. Nothing like the grand temples tourists see today. The rich had bigger houses, of course, with decorated floors, and maybe a few slaves bustling around. But even then, privacy wasn't really a thing. Homes opened onto the street. Neighbors overheard everything, and daily life was very communal. Bathrooms, not glamorous. A pot, a bucket, or if you were lucky, a shared latrine. And no, toilet paper wasn't an option. They used pebbles or bits of pottery. Imagine the Yelp reviews on that system. Now, social life. For men, much of it revolved around the symposium. Basically, a drinking party with rules. Reclining on couches, sipping wine, talking about politics, philosophy, or who looked ridiculous in the marketplace. Women, respectable ones at least, weren't invited. Unless they were entertainers, musicians, or for women, life was more restricted. Most stayed home, managing the household. Spinning, weaving, raising children. Respectable women weren't supposed to be seen wandering the streets too much. Which makes all the later myths about scheming queens a little ironic, since ordinary wives were mostly stuck supervising chores. Speaking of children, education was mostly for boys. Wealthy boys learned reading, writing, music, and gymnastics. Because apparently, being able to recite poetry while doing push-ups was considered ideal. Girls, their education was focused on running the household, cooking, weaving, and maybe how to handle servants if the family could afford them. Not exactly the Socratic method. And then there was Sparta, which just had to be different. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and dumped into the Agoge, a military training program. Their lives became all about discipline, obedience, and fighting. Girls in Sparta, weirdly enough, had more freedom. They exercised, trained, and could even own property. By Greek standards, that was practically revolutionary. Clothing was simple, linen or wool tunics, sometimes dyed with bright colors. Rich folks added jewelry. Poor folks wore whatever didn't fall apart. No one was strutting around in togas. Those were Roman. And no, they didn't all wear armor every day. Most Greeks probably looked more like people in loose pajamas than statues of bronzed warriors. Then there's the legal system, which was chaotic. Athens, in particular, loved jury trials. But instead of 12 jurors, they'd have hundreds of citizens voting on a case. Imagine trying to sway an audience that big while your neighbor's uncle shouts about your cousin's debts. No wonder orators like Demosthenes became celebrities. Punishments could be strange. Fines were common. Exile was another favorite. Basically, please leave the city forever. Thanks. And then there was death by hemlock, famously given to Socrates. Not exactly humane, but very on brand for Athens. And let's not forget religion. It's soaked into everything. Festivals, sacrifices, temples. Most families had a small household shrine where they'd leave offerings to the gods. Sacrifices weren't just about devotion. They were also the best chance to eat meat. Big festival. Time for barbecue in honor of Zeus. The gods themselves were everywhere in daily conversation. People swore by them, blamed them, and prayed to them for everything from harvests to exam success. It was less about personal faith and more about keeping the cosmic order running. For leisure, Greeks enjoyed theater, tragedies, comedies, satyr plays. Yes, half-naked actors in masks pretending to be donkeys counted as entertainment. They also loved athletic contests, which is how the Olympics became such a thing. But everyday leisure, probably much smaller. Dice games, music, gossip, and naps. Always naps. So daily life in ancient Greece wasn't glamorous. It was practical, repetitive, and peppered with occasional drama. Wake up, eat bread dipped in wine, do chores, pray, maybe catch a play or a public speech, go to bed, rinse and repeat. Most people weren't philosophers in marble porticos. They were tired, hungry, and hoping their neighbors' goats didn't trample their crops again. Take a breath here. Let the noise of the agora fade. The shouts of sellers, the chatter of gossip, the clatter of sandals on stone. Next, we'll drift into ancient Greek religion in more detail. Not just daily rituals, but how the myths shaped their worldview, their politics, and their constant anxiety about keeping the gods happy. If there's one thing the Greeks were never short on, it was gods. They had gods for the sky, gods for the sea, gods for the hearth, and probably a minor god for stubbed toes, if you dug deep enough into local cults. Religion wasn't about personal salvation, like later traditions. It was about keeping balance, make the right sacrifices, honor the right gods, and maybe, your crops won't fail, your ship won't sink, and your children won't die of some mysterious fever. The gods were powerful, but not exactly moral. Zeus couldn't keep his toga on. Hera was jealous. Poseidon threw tantrums. Dionysus partied a little too hard. These weren't role models so much as cosmic landlords. You didn't love them. You feared them, appeased them, and hoped they'd notice someone else's mistakes instead of yours. Festivals were the heartbeat of Greek religion. Whole cities would shut down for days, sacrificing animals, holding parades, and putting on plays. The Panathenaic Festival in Athens honored Athena with music, athletics, and a grand procession. The Olympic Games honored Zeus, an entire international spectacle built around sweaty athletes and bragging rights. Sacrifices were essential. Animals were offered, usually bulls, goats, or pigs. The gods supposedly got the smoke and bones, while humans feasted on the meat, which, conveniently, made religion a very effective way to organize a barbecue. Each city had its patron deity. Athens had Athena, of course, Corinth had Poseidon. Sparta claimed Eris, which feels predictable. But every village and household also had its own local shrines and minor gods. The Greeks weren't picky. The more divine insurance policies, the better. And they didn't stop at gods. There were also heroes, legendary figures, who got their own cults. People prayed to Achilles, Heracles, or Theseus for favors. Basically celebrity worship, but with blood sacrifices. Now, let's talk about oracles. If you wanted advice in the ancient world, you didn't hire a consultant. You went to a priestess in a temple, usually one surrounded by smoke, chanting, and vague mutterings. The most famous was the Oracle of Delphi, where the priestess, the Pythia, would sit over a fissure, inhaling vapors and babbling cryptic lines. Priests would then interpret these into advice. Need to decide whether to start a war? Ask Delphi. Spoiler: the oracle would always give an answer vague enough that, no matter what happened, it could be claimed as correct. A brilliant business model, really. Religion also shaped family life. Birth, rituals, marriage ceremonies, funerals, all had religious elements. Dying without proper rites was considered a disaster because it meant your spirit might wander restlessly instead of joining the ancestors. Which explains why Greek tragedies are filled with people screaming about burial rites. And yes, they believed in the afterlife. Sort of, but it wasn't glamorous. The underworld, ruled by Hades, wasn't heaven or hell. It was just gray, souls drifting in the gloom, occasionally sipping from the river, Lethe to forget their lives. Unless, of course, you were a hero. Then you might get a spot in the Elysian Fields, a kind of VIP lounge for the dead. Everyone else just existed forever. Comforting, right? What makes Greek religion especially fascinating is how it seeped into politics and art. Temples weren't just spiritual sites. They were statements of civic pride. Leaders claimed divine favor. Myths were carved into marble friezes, painted on vases, recited in poetry. Even philosophy couldn't quite shake religion. Sure, some thinkers mocked the gods or tried to explain the world without them. But even then, the language of religion hung around. When Socrates was sentenced to death, part of the charge was impiety. The myths themselves, they were messy, contradictory, and endlessly entertaining. Different cities had different versions. In one, a hero might be noble. In another, he was a villain. The Greeks didn't mind. Myths weren't about consistency. They were stories that explained the chaos of the world. Why do we have seasons? Because Persephone spends part of the year in the underworld. Why do we have wine? Because Dionysus got drunk and invented it. Why is the sky full of stars? Because Zeus liked turning people into constellations whenever they annoyed him. It was religion, but it was also theater, folklore, and cultural glue. So imagine being an ordinary Greek. You wake up, pour a libation to the household gods, go about your day, and constantly navigate a world where divine temper tantrums might explain why your neighbor's olive tree is doing better than yours. Comforting, maybe, or just stressful. Take another breath. Let the incense of the temples fade. The chants, the prayers, the endless sacrifices. Next, we'll drift into Greek philosophy, where some people decided to question everything, invent logic, and argue about whether the universe was made of water, numbers, or just endless atoms bouncing around. If you were a wealthy man in ancient Greece with a lot of free time, philosophy was basically your version of Netflix. You sat around in the marketplace, asked baffling questions, and hoped people thought you were profound rather than insufferable. And it started early. The very first philosophers, way back in the 6th century BCE, were less wise sages and more eccentric uncles at the dinner table. Take Thales of Miletus. He is often called the first philosopher because he decided the world wasn't explained by the gods, but by natural elements. His big idea, everything is ultimately water. Yep, not fire. Not air, not stardust, just water. Did it make sense? Not really, but it was groundbreaking because it suggested that the universe had a rational explanation. Then came Anaximander, who looked at Thales' water theory and said, no, it's something more abstract, an endless, undefined substance called the apeiron, which is basically philosopher speak for I don't know, but it's not water. And then there was Heraclitus. He's the guy who famously said, you can't step into the same river twice. His philosophy boiled down to, everything is change, everything is in motion, fire is the essence of reality, and people are generally terrible at paying attention. He had a gloomy, cryptic style that made him sound very deep, even if you couldn't quite pin down what he meant. On the flip side was Parmenides, who argued the exact opposite. Nothing changes at all. Change is an illusion. The world is one, unchanging, eternal thing. Imagine being in the same symposium as Heraclitus. One guy shouting about fire and change, the other insisting it's all fake. Dinner must have been fun. The Greeks adored contradictions. That's where the atomists came in. Leucippus and Democritus argued that everything is made of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms, moving through the void. For the 5th century BCE, that's impressively close to modern science. Of course, they also thought atoms had little hooks and barbs, so they could cling together like Lego bricks, which is less accurate. Then came Pythagoras. Yes, the triangle guy. He wasn't just a mathematician. He was basically the leader of a cult. His followers lived communally, avoided beans for mystical reasons, and believed numbers were the essence of reality. For Pythagoras, the universe was built on harmony and proportion, a noble idea. Until you realize you're not allowed to eat lentil soup anymore. But the true drama of Greek philosophy kicks in with the sophists. These were traveling teachers who taught young men how to argue, not necessarily to find truth, but to win debates. If you could pay, they'd train you in rhetoric, which meant you could walk into court, twist logic around, and make yourself look good, even if you were guilty. Naturally, conservatives hated them. Enter Socrates, the grumpy old man of Athens. He didn't write anything himself, which is annoying for historians. So we only know him through others, mainly Plato. Socrates spent his days wandering the streets, asking people probing questions until they realized they didn't actually know anything. The Socratic method, as we call it today, was basically philosophical trolling. People found him fascinating, but also incredibly irritating, and eventually, Athens decided they'd had enough. In 399 BCE, they put him on trial for corrupting the youth and impiety. Translation: he made too many people uncomfortable. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Socrates accepted it calmly, drank a cup of hemlock, and died surrounded by his students. It was tragic, but also very on brand for him. Then came Plato, his star pupil. Plato was obsessed with the idea that the physical world is just a shadow of a higher, perfect reality. The famous theory of forms. To him, everything we see is a messy copy of a flawless ideal, which means your chair isn't the chair. It's just a sad shadow of the perfect cosmic chair. Comforting, Plato also founded the Academy, one of the first real institutions of higher learning. Students gathered there to debate philosophy, mathematics, and politics. Basically, a very elite book club without the snacks. And then, the big one, Aristotle. He studied under Plato, but decided to disagree with him on almost everything. Where Plato loved abstract ideas, Aristotle was practical. He wanted to categorize the natural world, study biology, analyze logic, and write instruction manuals on basically everything. Plants, animals, ethics, politics, you name it. He had an opinion. He even tutored Alexander the Great, which explains a lot about why Alexander thought conquering the world was a good idea. Aristotle's influence lasted for centuries. Medieval scholars adored him, scientists quoted him, and unfortunately, doctors clung to some of his mistaken theories way too long. But still, the man was a machine of intellectual output. Beyond the big three, philosophy didn't stop. The Hellenistic period after Alexander's conquests gave us some of the most lifestyle-focused philosophies. The Stoics, led by Zeno, believed virtue was the only true good and that we should accept fate calmly. Don't get angry. Don't get overly happy. Just stay balanced. It's basically ancient mindfulness. The Epicureans, meanwhile, thought pleasure was the highest good, but not in the wild party sense. More like avoiding pain, living simply, and hanging out with friends in your garden. Think of it as the introvert's philosophy. And then there were the skeptics, who decided the smartest thing you could do was admit you can't really know anything for sure. Which, honestly, is a mood. So philosophy became a cornerstone of Greek culture. It wasn't separate from daily life. It influenced politics, education, and even how people thought about happiness. For the Greeks, asking questions was practically a civic duty, even if it annoyed everyone around you. Take a slow breath. Imagine the agora buzzing with debates. Old men in cloaks arguing about the nature of truth. Students scribbling notes on wax tablets. Philosophy could be grand and abstract, but it was also just part of life, a kind of intellectual background noise. Now, as we drift forward, let's glide into something equally important: Greek art and architecture. Because nothing says we had too much free time like carving perfect marble statues of gods with suspiciously flawless abs. If there's one thing the ancient Greeks excelled at, it was making things look ideal. Their art wasn't about capturing reality so much as inventing a shinier version of it. Think Instagram filters, but in marble. Take their statues. Early Greek sculptures, around the 7th century BC, looked a bit stiff. Upright figures, called kouroi, male youths, and korai, female youths. They stood rigid, 1 foot forward, staring blankly, with what's called the archaic smile. It wasn't really a smile, more of a weird smirk, like they'd just remembered an inside joke. But as time went on, statues got more naturalistic. Muscles rippled, drapery flowed, bodies twisted. By the classical period, Greek sculptors had mastered the art of making stone look like living flesh, and they were obsessed with balance and proportion. A statue wasn't just a person. It was the perfect person. Everyone was carved with abs, even philosophers who probably couldn't jog across the agora without wheezing. One of the most famous examples is the Discobolus, the discus thrower, frozen mid-swing, perfectly proportioned, perfectly balanced, perfectly unrealistic. No actual athlete looks that graceful mid-throw, but the Greeks weren't after realism. They were after the ideal human form. And then there was architecture. If you've ever seen a building with tall columns and triangular pediments, you're looking at a Greek idea recycled for the millionth time. The Greeks basically invented Western architecture's greatest hits. The Doric order was the simplest. Chunky columns, no fancy bases, plain capitals. Solid, sturdy, very don't mess with me. The Ionic order was more elegant. Thinner columns with scroll-like volutes on top. The architectural equivalent of someone twirling their mustache. And then came the Corinthian order, which was even fancier, with capitals covered in carved acanthus leaves. The ancient equivalent of saying, "Yes, I would like more decoration, please, all of it." The crown jewel, of course, was the Parthenon in Athens. Built in the 5th century BCE, dedicated to Athena, it was both a temple and a statement piece. Everything about it screamed perfection, down to the fact that the columns aren't perfectly straight. They're subtly curved to correct optical illusions. So to the human eye, the whole structure looks flawlessly straight, which means the Greeks were so obsessed with perfection that they deliberately built in flaws. To hide flaws, exhausting, really. Inside stood a massive gold and ivory statue of Athena. We daren't have it anymore. Gold tends to get recycled when times get tough. but contemporary descriptions make it sound absurdly grand. Athena gleaming, armed, towering. Imagine walking in barefoot, candle smoke swirling, and seeing a goddess who probably weighed as much as a warship. Subtle, not really. Temples weren't the only public buildings. The Greeks also built theaters, stoas, and gymnasiums. Theaters, like the one at Epidaurus, were engineering marvels, perfect acoustics. You could hear a whisper on stage even from the cheap seats in the back, all without microphones. Just clever math and stone. Gymnasiums weren't gyms in the modern sense, but places for exercise, education, and socializing. They were basically wellness centers, complete with running tracks, baths, and lecture spaces. Athenian elites would work out naked, because of course they would, then go discuss philosophy while cooling down. And don't forget the agoras, open plazas lined with stores, where political debates, trade, and gossip all mixed together. Greek architecture wasn't just about looking good, it was about shaping civic life. When it came to painting, the Greeks preferred decorating pottery. Vases with black figure or red figure designs show myths, athletes, and daily life. You'll see Achilles chasing Hector, or just some guy drinking wine while reclining on a couch. Art swung from epic to casual, all in the same clay jug. Wall painting probably existed too, but almost none survives. Which is tragic, because if their statues and vases are any clue, their murals must have been dazzling. The Romans later copied them, so we at least get echoes. What's interesting is how art and architecture tied back to religion and politics. A temple wasn't just a place to pray. It was civic propaganda. Look how fancy our goddess's house is. Clearly, the gods love us. Sculptures weren't just decoration. They were statements about ideal citizenship, heroism, and order. And yet, there's a kind of calm timelessness in all of it. Standing under marble columns, surrounded by statues with serene faces, you get the sense that the Greeks wanted beauty to outlast the chaos of daily life, which, given how often they were at war, makes sense. So, as the marble dust settles, take a slow breath. Picture the Acropolis glowing in the sunset, statues staring into the distance with that eternal calm. Columns rising like frozen music. The Greeks built for eternity, or at least for as long as marble holds up against earthquakes. Next, we drift into Greek theater and literature. Because what? Is the point of a giant stone stage if you don't fill it with men in masks shouting about fate? The Greeks loved stories. They told them at feasts, painted them on vases, carved them into temples, and eventually acted them out for everyone to see. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was history, religion, civic duty, and therapy all rolled into one. Let's start with the oldest layer, epic poetry. The big names here are Homer and Hesiod. Homer, whoever he was, and scholars still argue if he was one man, many poets, or just a mythical figure himself, gave us the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad is basically one long rant about the Trojan War, with heroes sulking, gods interfering, and way too many people dying with overly detailed spear wounds. The Odyssey, on the other hand, is a road trip story, or rather, a sea trip story. Odysseus spends 10 years trying to get home, encountering Cyclopes, sirens, witches, and the eternal annoyance of Poseidon. Both epics are about war, honor, pride, and survival, but also about how messy humans are. The gods appear constantly, sometimes helping, sometimes sabotaging, usually just proving that divine beings are as petty as mortals. Then there was Hesiod, who wrote the Theogony, basically a family tree of the gods, which is chaotic, violent, and confusing. If you thought your extended family was messy, try following the Greek pantheon's divorces, betrayals, and monster children. Hesiod also wrote Works and Days, which mixed farming advice with moral lessons. Think of it as half agricultural manual, half grumpy blog post. Now, on to theater. If Athens had a beating cultural heart, It was the stage. Plays were performed during religious festivals, especially those honoring Dionysus, the god of wine, theater, and generally losing control. So yes, drama was literally a sacred act. There were two main flavors, tragedy and comedy. Tragedy came first. The three titans of tragic drama were Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Aeschylus is often called the father of tragedy. His plays are heavy, full of gods and fate and thunder. He loved big themes, justice, vengeance, divine will. His Oresteia trilogy tells the bloody saga of Agamemnon's family, where everyone murders everyone else, and the cycle of vengeance only ends when the gods step in to create a law court. Cheery stuff. Sophocles took tragedy and polished it. He gave us Oedipus Rex, the play where poor Oedipus discovers he killed his father and married his mother. Imagine being in the 5th century BCE audience, already knowing the myth, and just watching this poor man dig himself deeper into disaster. Sophocles was a master of irony. The audience always knew the truth before the characters did, which makes the whole thing both painful and darkly funny. Euripides was the edgy one. He questioned the gods, made his characters more human, and liked to spotlight outsiders, women, slaves, foreigners. His Medea is infamous. A woman betrayed by her husband takes revenge by killing their children. The audience would have gasped, but Euripides forced them to sit with the rawness of human rage. Tragedy was cathartic. You sat through hours of characters suffering, and by the end, you felt cleansed, or at least glad your own life wasn't that bad. Then came comedy, which was the perfect counterbalance. The big name here is Aristophanes. His plays were sharp, silly, and deeply political. In Lysistrata, women go on a sex strike to force men to end the Peloponnesian War. In The Clouds, he mocked Socrates as a ridiculous fraud, dangling from a basket in his thinkery. In The Frogs, Dionysus goes to the underworld to bring back a playwright, and the dead dramatists hold a literal contest of words. Aristophanes blended slapstick with satire, fart jokes with political critique. Theater wasn't just about escape. It was about confronting reality with humor. Later comedies, in the so-called New Comedy of Menander, were less political and more about domestic life. Misunderstandings, romantic entanglements, stock characters like grumpy fathers and tricky slaves. Basically, sitcoms before television. Theatrical performance itself was a spectacle. Actors wore masks with exaggerated expressions so even the back rows could see. Only men acted, so male actors played women too, sometimes very convincingly, sometimes less so. Costumes were elaborate, and the chorus, a group of singers and dancers, commented on the action, offering moral reflection, background info, or just musical interludes. Theaters were open air, carved into hillsides, holding thousands of people. Picture an entire city crammed into seats, watching myths retold in the blazing sun. The voices of actors echoing across the valley. It wasn't just art. It was civic ritual. Greek literature didn't stop there. Historians like Herodotus and Thucydides wrote prose that read almost like theater. Herodotus spinning curious tales about distant lands, Thucydides delivering cold, rational accounts of war and politics. Philosophers, too, often wrote in dialogue form, blurring the line between philosophy and drama. It all fed into the Greek obsession with words, with performance, with turning life itself into something you could narrate. So, as the lights dim in the stone theater and the chorus hums, one last line, we can stretch and let the applause fade. Greek literature gave us gods, heroes, ordinary households, and biting satire, all wrapped in verse and masks. It was the voice of the city, echoing into eternity. Enough boring history for one night. I'll stop here so you can drift off.